Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And a congressional commission analyzes the risks of using energy infrastructure built by China. One commissioner said that this sector has been a potential battlefield for the CCP. NTD's Jason Blair has more.
In a hearing, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission focused on the situation and risks of China's role in critical mineral supply chains, fossil fuel markets, and overseas clean energy infrastructure investments.
Officials in capitals around the world are now investigating the risks of Chinese investment and control over critical electrical infrastructure. Chinese manufactured hardware could introduce hidden vulnerabilities such as remote kill switches and data collection capabilities.
And Mr. Brand says that recent intrusions by state-sponsored actors into critical U.S. infrastructure like Volt Typhoon serve as indicators of China's capabilities and intents.
When the United States raised concerns about these cyber operations last December, Chinese officials reportedly linked these activities to geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, a sobering reminder that energy infrastructure has become a potential battlefield in great power competition.
Senator Clark Goodwin says that China accounts for 2/3 of the world's wind and solar power projects that are under construction.
China positions itself as a climate champion, but in reality, it has been the world's largest annual emitter of carbon dioxide for almost 20 years.
The hearing also focused on China's global dominance in critical mineral supply chains and the risks of countries being dependent on China for them.
There are strong indications that China is consolidating its hold over critical minerals and is prepared to use its position as geopolitical leverage amid escalating trade tensions.
Yet critical minerals are perhaps the most vivid illustration of how Beijing leverages its central position in energy supply chains to support state interests.
Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
President Trump today repeated that trade negotiations are underway with Chinese officials, despite China denying such negotiations taking place. To dive into this, we're joined by John Sidelides, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors and former diplomacy consultant at the State Department. John Sidelides, thank you so much for joining us here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, China is saying that negotiations between the U.S. and the CCP are not occurring right now, and they said that in order for that to happen, the U.S. needs to drop some of its tariffs first. What kind of situation is the CCP in here? If they make the first move, does that make them lose face?
Well, let's keep in mind, first of all, that there's a difference, and maybe this is purely semantic, in how one approaches quote-unquote negotiations or dialogue. The Chinese tend to be, at least under the CCP, very formalistic, very methodical, and probably absolutely correct in their public pronouncements. So there are no formal negotiations, no formal dialogue taking place. At the same time, Team Trump is saying that they're in constant contact, which they probably are at a very low level. And so from Trump's perspective, it's taking advantage of every opportunity to see whether or not there is something that connects Washington and Beijing to then begin to formalize a process for negotiations, while Xi Jinping and his team are saying there's no dialogue and no negotiations taking place. So both can actually be accurate at the same time.
And on the other end of this is how long China's economy can hold out. We have Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, saying that China can move in the direction of from its overcapacity, overconsumption, overcapacity exports to helping its own domestic demand, and that the U.S. will help it do so. How is that likely to go over with the CCP?
That's going to be quite the challenge, I think, from Washington's perspective. China is, I think, in a position both to be able to absorb the blows, both economically and politically. And there's really not much talk about the political controls that an authoritarian regime like the Chinese Communist Party maintains over 1.3 billion Chinese citizens, which is an important part of this. I mean, Trump, to his disadvantage, is the president of a democracy. There are so many different inputs from voters, from lawmakers at various levels, from the chief executives of major corporations, to lean on the White House to explain why these tariff negotiations, if they come into place, or the trade war overall, are very deleterious to these constituents and these stakeholders. You don't have that in China. There are methods for oppressing any dissent, minimizing dissent, whether it's police surveillance, whether it's a crackdown, a very harsh crackdown in those areas, especially by workers that are rebelling, where they are most affected by the U.S. tariffs. So I think they're able to minimize any type of political dissent in a way that simply a democratically elected leader cannot. And economically, the sense that I have is that the Chinese economy and Chinese society is hardwired for a greater pain threshold. They can endure more pain than, say, the average middle class American consumer if we have a prolonged trade war.
And so we're seeing that China is over subsidizing its exports. Do you think that Beijing has terms for diffusing this kind of conflict in terms of how its current system operates with an export-based system?
That's the $64,000 question, as we like to say. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made very clear that there is a global trade disequilibrium from Washington's perspective, and that global trade and U.S.-China trade specifically needs to be rebalanced. And there were greater protests now from the Trump administration about China's sort of industrial policy, very heavy subsidies of manufacturing and industry to provide for greater exports to global markets, rather than focusing on expanding the consumer market inside of China domestically and provide for greater balance so that we don't have all of these Chinese trade surpluses with every country or most countries around the world, but especially here in the United States. But China, I think, is very determined to rebalance or recalibrate its trade ties with the U.S. or any other country at its own choosing, its own timing. And again, I think they want to be very careful to not be perceived as caving in or capitulating to President Trump's demands or that of any of his secretaries.
Moving over to another issue here, China is saying that they're sending back Boeing jets, and Boeing's considering, their CEO's considering not doing business with China anymore, sending their airplanes over there. Trump posted on Truth Social this morning, quote, Boeing should default China for not taking the beautifully finished planes that China committed to purchase. This is just a small example of what China has done to the USA for years. And by the way, fentanyl continues to pour into our country from China through Mexico and Canada, killing hundreds of thousands of our people, and it better stop now. Now, how does this fit into the larger picture of doing business with China? Could we see more companies leaving China?
Well, I think that's going to be the course of the U.S.-China relationship one way or the other on high-risk industries. I don't know if aerospace necessarily fits in there, and I'm not privy to the internal discussions at Boeing, of course, but the question is going to be, to whom does Boeing sell the airplanes that China had contracted to purchase? I mean, they have very stiff competition from Airbus. That's a global trade competition, so I don't really know what the market is immediately for any excess airplanes that Boeing has to sell if the Chinese decide not to proceed with those contracts. But on the larger scale, if I might emphasize, I think there is going to be, or at least the effort is underway, to significantly de-risk the American economy from dependence on the Chinese economy for national defense, for advanced technology, for energy, for pharmaceuticals, for medical equipment. As we learned during the COVID lockdowns, we were so dependent on China for so many of the aspects of our national defense and our economic and societal well-being. And this is simply unsustainable when, at the same time, the Chinese military is preparing for a possible military showdown with the United States over Taiwan, over the Philippines, or the South China Sea. In what universe is a great power dependent on its primary military adversary for all of the aspects of societal well-being and national defense? So this has to change. And whether it's under President Trump's administration, whether it's conjoined to a successive administration or several, this may take 5, 10, 15 years. But I believe in those areas, the de-risking is underway and will likely be a sustained policy, hopefully across Republican and Democratic administrations, while we're still buying perhaps T-shirts, electronics, furniture, things like that from China, which don't really have an impact on the essentials of national security and economic well-being.
John Sitilides, thank you very much for your insights here today.
Thanks again for having me.
Coming up, the Department of Homeland Security canceling grants to Harvard, what that money is supposed to be for, and why Harvard won't back down. We'll get insights from